So, questions? Yes.
I want to address the question of terminology, and you mentioned that our Prime Minister had put pressure on to use the term Daesh. Now, we all know what that means in Arabic, but I feel that it is entirely preferable to use that term rather than ISIS. First of all, ISIS, I have a Coptic friend who's called Isis, and I'm sure she's not thrilled at the name. It is also the name of an Egyptian goddess. But more importantly, the whole question of Islamic State. They have no constitutional, no legal right to call themselves a state. And in the unwitting minds of the readers, of course, it starts to cement.
So do you think that this is something that the press could have steered in a way?
Well, I think the press can show a precedent and not use the term ISIS and use Daesh instead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's an interesting, it's an important actually observation. Yes, Doctor. Would you mind actually identifying yourselves, and if you could stand up so that everybody else could see what you're doing. No pressure.
Thanks. Emma Cunliffe, Endangered Archaeology at Oxford. So we've gone straight into talking about Daesh, which is fair, they are a big story. But obviously today we've also heard about the destruction in Yemen. In Syria, there was considerable site destruction and extensive looting before Daesh ever came on the scene. And obviously you have the problem, as you quite rightly said, of story of the day. So my question is, first, it's sort of two parts. How do we get round the idea of story of the day? Because you come to, well, you need to come to the experts. Well, that's great, but you're not necessarily telling the stories that we think need to be told. So how do we get round that? And then when you say, well, you know, we've got these deadlines that we have to meet, is, well, I'm just part of the system, the right response?
I'm going to take another question and then we'll bunch them up. Vesta?
Vesta Curtis, British Museum. I agree that we should not use the term ISIS because we give credibility to these actually murderous people. But Daesh is the same. I mean, what does it stand for? It's the Dawlat. It's the Islamic State as well in Arabic. So we shouldn't use that either. I think we should inform ourselves before, making a verdict. There is a question that I have actually. You know, when looking at these films with the destruction of Hatra and Mosul, it must have occurred to you as journalists where these hooligans, these people, get their tractors, their weapons, their hammers from. And this question has never been asked. They use very, very modern tools. And who funds them? This is the vital question that comes in. Who gives them these tools so that they can attack these monuments?
Thank you.
And I have an answer for that. Saudi Arabia. Okay. But, of course, we don't like to mention it.
This is the Iran Heritage Fund.
Yes.
But I think
So,
this was...
can I just, we're going to bunch
Yeah.
three questions. Ivan McQuiston, yeah.
Hello, it's me again, Ivan McQuiston. I was here, as you know, earlier as a speaker to represent the Antiquities Dealers Association. As a journalist myself of 30 years standing, I understand the pressures, and this is really a question for Sebastian and Maev, because of the types of pressures you're put under. Speculation is one thing. Verifying the facts. I know all about deadlines. Where do you draw the line? Do you actually go with a story if you can't verify it properly? You can't leave a hole in the paper or on the screen. I think that division for me is particularly difficult. I want to know how you handle that.
I think if you put up something that is pure speculation, and sometimes you do have to, because it has become the story of the day, and people are going to say, why didn't you cover it? Did you censor it? You have an obligation to go back. You have an obligation to say, we don't know now, and you have an obligation to go back. And I think that's what, on the whole, the media are not good at. You know, like I say, the circus moves on. But you do have an obligation to keep digging away, which is where Martin is a genius in the field. He does not give up. Very often we move on to the next horror. But I do think, as individuals and as media organisations, we have a responsibility to stick with the story and try and find the truth. But it's very difficult, as you know yourself from your paper.
Well, there were two questions. Thank you for that. There were two questions. One relating to what we call this organization, and the other one relating to where the funding is coming from.
I don't think there's an answer to the naming question. I think it's a question which tells you more about where the question is coming from than the actual answer, because there isn't an answer. I mean, there are many different answers, and you can accept one or not accept another, up to you. So, I can't speak for the BBC, as I say, because I'm not here for that. I mean, the only thing I would say is that I would say perhaps we, as journalists who were covering the story as it was moving, just because it was a moment of certainty, when Baghdadi stood up and announced, "This is who we are now, and that's our name," we moved to it very quickly because it was actually something there which was concrete. And then you're stuck with that as a name because you've started calling them by that name. And, who knows, perhaps that was a mistake, because the strongest argument, obviously, against using their name, Islamic State, is, of course, the argument that I've heard many times, and is absolutely correct argument to make, that it is giving, obviously, a terribly negative image of Islam by mistake, almost, by doing that.
It gives a credence to a state that has no constitution.
No, I would disagree with that. I would disagree with that. Calling something a state doesn't give you that, and can often have the other effect. I think that applies in many things. People call themselves something. It doesn't mean they're that. And if it's clear that they're not that, then, and if Islamic State proves to some extent that it is a state of some kind, then it will start to have a bit more point to it. So I don't think, personally, I don't think you can argue on that.
I fear that this name issue
will never go away.
Has no solution. Yes. Okay. Martin, do you have anything to add to that?
Just a very small point about
Absolutely.
About the terminology. Initially, the Art newspaper decided to call it, instead of the Islamic State, we then said Islamic State. It's then abbreviated to IS. And then, for reasons I'm not quite clear, we changed Islamic State to ISIL. And there was then another sort of compromise agreement that we wouldn't actually spell it out what it meant. The sub said that we always had to spell out what an abbreviation was when we were writing an article, unless it was something so obvious like US. So now we just don't spell out what it means. But of course, the other side of that coin is that you're therefore assuming it's initial like United States, which is so accepted that you don't need to say what it is. So there is no easy way out of this question. But
time is short. I'm going to take just one or two more questions. The funding issue, Vesta, probably doesn't have an answer. Yesterday there was an interesting piece in the FT. They led on.
No, but it's a key question, obviously.
But it's a key question with a non-answer.
And I don't think it's all coming out of selling little bits of broken masonry or sites.
Okay, well, they're not broken, they're very important items. Anyway,
they're very beautiful bits of broken masonry.
This lady here, then Susanne there. Any others? No. Oh, yes, there.
My name is Lamia Zedani. Before I start my complaint, Martin, for you, I think it was the Art newspaper in 2003, the day the museum was looted. You telephoned me, one of you telephoned me, and took the guide to the Iraq Museum from me. And it was in Arabic, I'm afraid. Yeah, I just remembered it.
Did you return it?
Yes.
I did, and we scanned it and put it on our website.
Yeah, put it online or something.
Yeah.
No, what I'm saying is the press has been, or did a lot of frenzy about Nimrud, Hatra, and so on. It's the ancient times. The Islamic ones in Mosul, I don't know. It is so important. They are so important for the city of Mosul. Mosul lost its history, complete history, and yet it hardly is mentioned, just because I can't explain why no one is doing anything about that. Architecturally, there are 13 fluted domes that has been lost. In the whole of Iraq, we don't have even 30 of them. So 13 of them has disappeared forever. And yet none of the press has made the news like, sorry, John, it's about Nimrud or Hatra.
I can give you a cynical explanation, but IS is there before us. It's a pretty story. Yeah. IS have been brilliant at choosing photogenic sites. And a lot of the sites, like some of your slides, you have to explain what it is and what the damage is. It's not instantly...
Can we just move to a second question, because time is short and I can feel the glare of John Curtis. Susan.
I have to say, one really feels sympathy for the pressures put on journalists on such issues. And it's no surprise that some of the best journalists we know end up becoming authors, giving up on journalism, and start writing books, actually, that allow them to reflect on subjects that they have covered for years and wondered what's behind it, what's in front of it, and so forth. It seems to me that something about the way journalism and our legitimate media, not the Daesh or ISIL media does, is always reactive rather than proactive. You have mentioned it already in many, many different ways, but also that it has just as short an attention span as the Daesh counts for, and its audience likes to consume it. So it seems to me that something is missing in having the kind of reportage that does not sustain a certain degree of depth and breadth. The Daesh didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of the vacuum in Iraq. Probably it's related to what happened in Afghanistan, and of course the disruption of everything in Syria. So there are various ways one can think about these, a little bit more historically located. We are not talking about going back to the colonial period, but at the very least going back to maybe the time of invasion of these places, the ways in which dynamics of various governments and the political interests have played out there. That to me seems to be why journalism is unsatisfactorily responding to what Daesh so powerfully is accomplishing, really.
This gentleman here.
Hafid Walda. Anyway, I think a friend of mine from the Middle East told me that dash means that, in the slang, that's something you step on. So this is why they dislike you step on, put under your foot. So this is why I think the people in Daesh don't like it. This is an explanation. The other thing I want to talk about is what actually makes a good report. If you have a good contacts on the ground, really reliable, cultivated contacts. I remember when Tripoli has fallen, the day Tripoli has fallen, I've been contacted by The Guardian, I think David Smith or something. I can't remember his name. And he wants to really verify that the museum is intact. And the Museum of Tripoli, the National Museum, sits in the middle of Green Square. And everything happening that time, that moment, in Green Square. So we put him in touch with the people in the museum. They opened the museum specifically for him, have a picture and pictures, and I have this fantastic article, reliable, in the moment, in the time, and to me this is a fantastic opportunity, and just due to the fact that you have a contact, local contact in the ground.
Thank you. If you could keep your comments very brief, because you need to move on.
Well, I've got a couple of really kind of boring answers to those questions. I mean, the ISIS one is, if you want depth, there is depth. Journalism does provide it. I mean, there have been many books written about it. There's many long articles, long features, and so on and so forth. I think often when people talk about journalism, you know, they're talking about what is the most immediate stuff that they've come across. And the fact is, you're never going to be able to get into a minute, a 30, a 2-minute package, if you're lucky, that kind of thing. I mean, you have to, in that type of journalism, you just have to inform whatever you say with that knowledge, so that it defines what you say, so that you don't say stuff that is wrong, but you don't necessarily say the other stuff. There's just no way around it. I mean, just for example, I mean, you're talking about Libya. A friend of mine who's out there at the moment in Libya was complaining to me a couple of days ago. You may know Libya. There's a number of different governments there. There's a number of different peace tracks, et cetera, et cetera. So she said she was asked by the news desk, could she explain the whole thing for them in 35 seconds? She said, yeah. She wrote the longest intro that you've ever had in your life. So her intro was about 2 minutes, and then her piece was 35 seconds. You have to do what you do with the medium to some extent. And you can't always be passive, in my understanding, as a lot of people, and blame the media like it's one set thing, obviously, which is deciding and doing this. There are many, many, from good to bad, from in-depth to not in-depth. And as you want the news, obviously, you go to certain elements of the news for immediacy. You go to other things for more depth. You know, difference between broadcast, newspaper, magazine, books, the whole thing. I mean, it is there. It's not there. The problem is it's often too late. In ISIS, it's probably been a bit late for many, many reasons.
Martin?
Sorry. Well, you might come back in, but we have a feature called, very appropriately, The Long Read, which runs regularly to about 3,000 words. And we have a really sinister bit of kit now, you may have it as well, where you can actually track exactly what people are reading and how long they read it for and when they go away to make a cup of coffee. And an extraordinary number of people start out reading those long read pieces and they're gone by the 4th paragraph. Yeah. Whereas our live blog, which does the very best job it can. It tells the story as vividly as it can, but as truthfully as it can, will literally get millions of readers. And I think there is, of course there's a role for reflective journalism. Of course there's a role for the kind of academic studies that you are doing. It's crucial. But I do think there is also a role for telling the story as vividly and as quickly and as honestly as you can, because you need to spread the word of what's happening. It's what we do.
Good. Well, thank you very much. That's a very good note on which to wrap up. This has been a very challenging and a very interesting session. Pity we can't go on for much longer. But thank you all three for being with us today, and on we move. Who's next?